Okay, second video about the beginnings of the Cold War and more exactly about the work that was done at the end of the Second World War to build a better world on behalf of the victors of World War II. So after exploring the early days of the United Nations, it's now time to have a look at what happened at the economic level. And that's the building of a new economic order that was known as the Bretton-Woods system. So it's important to have in mind the intellectual context of the time regarding economics. And obviously, one economic doctrine had started to dominate the world economics. And that would last from the late 30s to the mid 70s, and its economic doctrine is called Keynesianism, named after John Maynard Keynes, a British economist. So, in order to understand the importance of this doctrine and the reason why it was implemented by statesmen and government all over the world after World War II, it's important to understand that an analysis of the causes of World War II had been done by any informed people all over the planet, and in particular statesmen, who understood that the Great Depression of the 1930s had been obviously a major cause of the Second World War, but that this Great Depression had resulted from the excesses of unregulated capitalism in the previous period. And so the extreme liberty that was given to businessmen, and in particular those of the financial sector, had led to great instability with the New York's Wall Street crash and all the economic turmoil that had followed that. So the first government to get inspired by the writings of Keynes was the US government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So we already studied that he had been elected in 1933, so in the middle of the Great Depression in the USA, on a political platform nicknamed the New Deal. And this New Deal had been strongly inspired by the ideas of Keynes, which were basically based on one key idea, which is that the state must play a great interventionist role in the economy, in particular in times of depression, when only the state is able to invest because it does not fear the economic risk. And many laws are needed to regulate the economies in order to have a more stable economy. We must add that the Second World War had compelled governments of the rich countries of the world to launch an almost state-run management of the economy in the strategy of total war. And so the idea of big government, the idea of a government powerful enough to strongly regulate capitalism, had become a mainstream idea. Clearly, Keynesianism can be seen as a kind of compromise between pure capitalism and socialism or communism. Of course, the existence of the USSR, a communist economy, so non-capitalist economy, that had managed to avoid the Great Depression and to be a powerful enough economy to win the war against Germany, this fact was obviously a major factor of the success of Keynes' ideas. But one mistake that you must not make would be to think that Keynes' ideas were against capitalism. In fact, they were not. The idea of Keynes is that in order to survive and in order to provide society with benefits, capitalism is good, but capitalism must be regulated strongly by the state. So he wants to save capitalism, he didn't want to destroy it. He was not a communist. And so among the victors of World War II, and in fact also among the vanquished countries, the mood was in favor of a large role of the state in the management of the economy, in the reduction of inequalities, and in the social protection of the people. And obviously, the importance of the communist USSR in the victory was a big factor of that. For example, in France, the communists had played such an important role in the resistance that they could impose their demand for more social security and a government role to reduce inequalities to a conservative man like General de Gaulle. And this is the reason why in France the Sécurité sociale was made after 1945, and the same system was more or less created in Britain, which will be the object of a subsequent lesson. Now, that was for the, I would say, intellectual background. Now, more politically speaking and economically speaking, there was now a new situation in the world. The balance of powers in the capitalist world had now clearly changed. It was not totally new, but it had been largely confirmed by the war. Now the USA was by far the richest and more powerful country in the world. And clearly, World War II had pumped up, as stated on this cartoon, had increased the economic power of the USA because all the other major economies of the world had been damaged by the war, while the US territory had remained undamaged. The US economy had been fueled by the war effort. In fact, producing weapons, not only for the US Army, but for other armies in the world, had been great fuel to the industrial economy of the USA. And the result is that in 1944, 60% of world industrial production was made in the USA. So it's a peak that was absolutely historical. And financially speaking, well, as shown on this cartoon, most of the gold reserves in the world, 70% actually, were now in the USA, because the USA had become the world's creditor. It had lent money to all its allies, notably Britain, and so consequently the economy of the USA was by far the most important economy in the world. I mean, it was the only strong economy in the world, and so the gap with all other economies was so huge that it was clear that stability in the future should be based on the strong power and the solidity of the US economy. And their president, Roosevelt, had decided that the USA had to play a leading international role now, notably with the creation of the United Nations. Moreover, after Roosevelt's death, there would be an increase in tensions with the USSR. And so even in the context of the Cold War, the idea that not only the USA but the other capitalist economies of the world should be successful and prosperous was also another good reason for the USA to act internationally and help the others. They wanted to help all those that could be US allies in the confrontation against communist Soviet Union. Moreover, and lastly, the USA produced so much output that it needed strong partners to become big markets for its exports. If France, the UK, Belgium and the other countries were not rich enough to buy American products, then the US economy would be affected negatively by that. So it was time for more solidarity in the world, but the USA would gain a lot in this new pattern. And so those were the reasons for the decisions made in a conference that led to the creation of the Bretton-Woods system, whose main principles that you must remember were the principles of regulation of the economy, something that would be forgotten a couple of decades later, and a progressive return to international free trade, which had been severely reduced by the Great Depression. We can say that, on the contrary, this second aspect of the Bretton Woods ideas was later never challenged, and that led to globalization. So we're talking about an international conference that took place before the end of the war in 1944 in Bretton-Woods, which was a holiday resort in the USA. Many countries were there, even the USSR had sent some representatives, more as an observer, obviously, because the economic system of the USSR did not match those of Western countries. But anyway, the goal of this conference was to set up a system of rules and procedures to regulate the international monetary system, because instability of the currencies had been one of the aspects of the Great Depression. The goal, so, was to reconstruct a safe international economy based on the idea that what had happened during the 1930s should never happen again. And as the 1930s had been characterized by national selfish policies in economy, something we can call economic nationalism, which had been pushed at its extreme limit by Nazi Germany, but not only. Now there was the idea that this individualism of the nations should come to an end. It should be the end of what we call competitive devaluation, which means that when a country decided to reduce the value of its money to be more competitive in its exports, or protectionism, when a country decided to suddenly raise taxes on imports in order to protect its industry. So the goal and the secret recipe for the future was supposed to be monetary stability. And all these principles led to the development of negotiations and eventually the writing of Bretton-Woods agreements, which I will detail now. So the Bretton-Woods agreement had three major goals. The first one was to create an international monetary system that would be stable, and to be stable it had to be based on the US dollar and the principle of fixed exchange rates. So it was based, as I presented earlier, on the fact that the financial power of the USA was by far more important than any other else. And the idea was that all the countries of the world could now consider the dollar to be as good as gold. So the dollar was becoming the best currency for international trade, because it was the currency that was, of course, the most stable, and consequently it was the currency in which businessmen and economies of the world could trust in. Okay, you could rely on the stability of this currency. And the principle of fixed exchange rates means that the value of all the other currencies in the world regarding the US dollar should remain stable. The idea was to develop an environment of confidence that would encourage investors all over the world to use their money without being afraid of possible economic crises. Okay. Of course, this was great for the US power. It reinforced the US power, which in any case was already there. Second point with the Bretton-Woods Agreement, in order to again bring the necessary stability to the world economy, institutions should be created. We have already mentioned them quickly because they were part of the United Nations. So they were the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The World Bank made loans for reconstruction initially, and later when damaged countries had been reconstructed, it still lived on and made loans for development projects. And the International Monetary Fund, IMF, could act like a fund of aid for countries that were facing problems with their currencies, that could not get enough dollars to finance their economies and public policies. And this role of the IMF is still existing today. So the link between Bretton-Woods and the United Nations project, I mean, is real, and in both cases we can talk of a multilateral approach. Even though at the World Bank and the IMF, all countries do not have the same power. I mean, rich countries are obviously more powerful in the decision making than the others, which means that the USA clearly controlled World Bank and the IMF. And the last idea of Bretton-Woods was to organize negotiations in order to favor the development of international trade. The limit on international trade was the high level of tariffs, also known as custom duty, so it's taxes on imports that can be chosen by some countries. The idea was to foster free trade. So the GATT was created, and in fact the GATT was a meeting, a forum, where countries of the world could negotiate in order to make treaties on trade. The idea was that, a bit like with the UN, negotiation should be very collective and not only from one country to another. So it should be multilateral decisions and not only bilateral decisions involving only two countries. On this graph, you can see that it started a process which would carry on up to the beginning of the 21st century, during which negotiation rounds of the GATT progressively involved more and more countries, to the point that in the 1990s a permanent institution called the World Trade Organization was created, still exists today. And thanks to these negotiations, there was a very significant decrease in the average level of tariffs in the world. Taxes on imports used to be by 1947 at 40% of the value of the goods, so extremely high compared to what it is today, where the average level is around 5%. So we now live in a totally different world where barriers on international trade are very low. This is one of the results of the decisions that were made at the end of World War II. And clearly, so the Bretton-Woods systems aimed to create an environment that could foster long-term investments, exchange stability, in order to permit a strong economic growth of the capitalist world, because obviously the Soviet bloc would not be part of these Bretton-Woods systems, being non-capitalist. And it worked remarkably well, at least until the 70s. Obviously, there is a link between the relevance of the Bretton-Woods system and the fact that the 3 decades that started in 1945 happened to be the 30 glorious years. 30 years of clear prosperity, strong economic growth in all the capitalist economies of the world. And it worked so well for one reason, because the USA wanted it to work. And here, the Cold War played a role, because if the capitalist system was prosperous, then this would be the best challenge put against the development of the communist bloc on the other side.